So welcome to the training today. Today's training is about who owns the records. And so I hope by the end of this, my goal is that you understand records created when we enter into a counseling relationship, that you understand the rules about those records. You understand how this changes when you are employed, which I'm being specific here about W-2 and 1099. And then the idea that we're all responsible for these records, but who's the custodian? And there are some rules coming up on the horizon for LPC. And we know that if it's affecting LPC, it's eventually going to affect LMFT and vice versa. And here we are in Texas, and we're trying to get a handle on all of these things. And so if you're watching this and you're a supervisor, I'm also going to bring in a little bit about associates as well. So if you're an associate, great. If you're a supervisor, great. But I am going to make it pretty generic for everybody because there were some new rules discussed at the January LPC board meeting by the Rules Committee. So yeah, it looks like Facebook is just giving us a hard no on this. So hopefully I'll get this worked out before study hall opens up in an hour. So I am going to share screen today. What I want you guys to see, first of all, is I am looking at the latest rules. So what you should notice, or what you should see here, it is officially the PDF for March 8th, 2023. And same thing for the LMFT rules. If you're looking at those, everything is up to date on the website. Let me put my phone on the ground, even though it's on Do Not Disturb. Folks can always break through, even if it's on Do Not Disturb. So when we talk about confidentiality, when we talk about protected health information, there are two words I'm going to put out there for you guys: the owner and the custodian. So when we talk about protected health information, PHI, who owns that? Well, it's always the client, right? Protected health information, confidentiality, sensitive information, it belongs to the client. They have the power over it. They always do. They always will. It is their information. What they decide to trust us with in session or in whatever our capacity is, whether it's a parenting facilitator or some other thing, that information that we're holding, that protected health information, which is their name, it could be their address, it could be some sort of information that, if discovered, would identify that person. So if you're in a small town, or if that person's a celebrity or something, where if somebody got a hold of that information, it could be traced back to that person. That's PHI. So who owns that? The client, the person who gave it to us. Who's the custodian of that? That means who gets to protect it? Well, we do. And so there are rules that pertain to the custodian of the records, how we protect it. And there are rules that will pertain to when we can release it, right? So we've got 882.36. In BHEC, we have 681.45 in the LPC code. In the corresponding code in the LMFT, we have Chapter 611, we have HIPAA. All of these things refer to how we protect it and how and under what circumstances we can release it. Now, I'm not going over that today. So if you are tuning in for that, I've got another training for you, right? That's going to talk about you release that when you feel like your client is a danger to themselves or someone else, or they reveal abuse of a child or an elder, right? Or you receive a subpoena. So those are the conditions under which you could release records as the custodian, as the person who created, as the person who's responsible, who's been entrusted with those records. But what I want to talk to you about is, let's say you work for an agency. Let's say you work in a group private practice. Then who is the custodian of those records, right? This is very, very important that you understand, because in the moment with that client, you have decisions to make whether or not to release or break that confidentiality, right? And we talk about those circumstances, but it's something completely different when it comes to, all right, who's responsible for keeping these records for 7 years? Who takes the subpoena? Who gets subpoenaed? Who takes the subpoena and decides to release the records? All of those things are in the realm of the custodian, right? And this is important because there are specific rules that pertain to that. So let's take a look, and it's going to take me a minute, but what I love doing is using my handy dandy search tool, records, right? And we see, okay, it's working on it. Thank you. Thank you, Adobe. So we have it didn't show you, but we have about 43 references to records. So I'm going to zip through these. So there's compliance with state and federal law. It says, yes, we have to obey Chapter 611 and HIPAA. Boom, boom, boom. We're going to keep going, open records. Now, when we talk about for each client, now we are in 681.4. So I'm just going to rewind a little bit here. 681.41, and again, the LMFT code has a corresponding ethical requirement. This is 681.41E8. The established plan, well, this is actually the record. Regardless of setting, a licensee must provide counseling only in the context of a professional relationship. Prior to providing services, a licensee must obtain from an individual a signed informed consent. Okay, now we're starting to generate some paperwork. We're generating artifacts. We're generating information that can be traced back to that client. And we see we must have an established plan for the custody and control of the clients. Now we have that owner. The owner is the client. We're just the custodian in the event of our death or incapacity or the termination of the licensees, that's us, counseling practice. All right, very good. But again, we're in that space of what if we work for an agency or something else? So I'm going to click next for each. Here we go, more information about what goes into the record. I'm not going into that. You guys download your own rules. You can see that. How long we keep the records. Now, S is key. Records created by licensees during the scope of their employment by agencies or institutions that maintain client records are not required to comply with Q and R of this section. So what is Q and R? For each client, a licensee must keep accurate records, blah, blah, blah. And R, in the absence of applicable state and federal laws, rules, or regulations, records held by a licensee must be kept for 7 years. Or 5 years past the age of majority. Now, those are custodial duties, right? Those are things you, as the records custodian, have to be responsible for. But the big but is if you work for somebody else who says that they're going to do that, well, they're going to do that. That means they get the subpoena. They're going to get the request by the client for their records. All of that is going to happen. You just kind of show up for work every day, start the record, keep the record, do all the things you're supposed to do, create the record. But it's up to the place where you work to maintain that record. So remember, that's S. S is key. I'm going to come back to that in a second because that's what's under the magnifying glass for these new rules. So I'm going to stop the share for a second while I do some scrolling. Actually, no, I'm going to turn it back on because I want you guys to see. I'm going to click next. This is 681.45. Again, this says, hey, licensee, you have to comply with state and federal laws regarding confidentiality, the exceptions to confidentiality, when you can break confidentiality under which circumstances. So I'm going to skip through that. I'm going to skip through the parenting facilitator because that is another training. And I'm going to get to the LPC associate. Now, this is when things start getting a little wonky because we know in Texas, LPC associates just got the go-ahead to be allowed to own their own practice. Now, they cannot be independent. They must be supervised, but they may own their own practice. So that means letter J, the possession, access, retention, control, maintenance, and destruction, sounds like custodian work to me, of client records is the responsibility of the person or entity that employs or contracts with the LPC associate, or in those cases where the LPC associate is self-employed, the responsibility of the LPC associate. Now, what I like about this language is that they say, and they did before as well, I don't know if you caught that, this is employs or contracts. Because remember, with contract, that 1099 status, that means you're very independent. You could be independent to the point where you keep your own records. So this is something to keep in mind if you contract with, I don't know, fill in the blank there, an agency or another private practice. This would be a point of discussion, right? You'd want to see in your employment contract, hey, agency I'm contracting with, you are truly the custodian, right? Like you're going to handle all this 7-year stuff and this thing if, you close down or somebody dies. That's on you, right? Not on me. The practice, agency, whatever, might come back and say, oh, wait, no, we contract with you. You're an independent contractor. Those records are yours. We're not going to handle that at all. It gets really dicey. I've heard of a case just the other day where the practice was actually owned by a non-licensed person. So are they going to handle the records? Are they under any obligation to maintain them like we have to in our license? So it's one of those questions that you should ask if you are a contracted licensed professional with a practice, whether it's an agency or a private practice. So here's what's on the agenda, though. Here's not my agenda. It's on the agenda for LPC, the LPC rulemaking committee. And so I will stop the share here because I have to go to the interwebs and I want to make sure I pull that up. So you guys know that I'm a rules junkie, and the way you find this information that I'm going to show you, it's not a mystery at all, right? I sign up for the emails. So when anything comes through the pipeline related to changes or things on the horizon, I'm the first to know, but that doesn't mean it's easy to find. So the way that I found this is, first of all, I got the email. Then I know to go to the BHEC website. And over here, I click on, this time I clicked on the LPC board. And then I go over here and I click meeting dates, agendas, and minutes. And this is where the fun starts. I go to past meetings, click, and then I get this gargantuan document. It's only 91 pages this time. It's usually much longer. This has everything that the board planned to talk about during that full meeting. So this is page 66. I'm going to come back to that, but I'll show you what the beginning looks like. Right? This is the agenda. Number 1, call to order. Number 2, roll call. So we are looking for 8, rulemaking. And then we see, okay, consideration and possible adoption of the following proposed rules and proposed amended rule changes, informed consent, and client records. This is where I was going, hey, I've got to do a training on this. So let me jump to 66. And here we are, informed consent. So the proposed new rule for informed consent First, they give us a comment. This proposed new rule transfers the existing requirements for informed consent from current 681.41 to the new rule, and it adds new language intended to create a standard by which informed consent can be provided by licensees to clients while licensees are employed by agencies or institutions where obtaining signed documentation may not be possible or easily accomplished. So you can imagine this if you're someone who works in a prison or you're someone who works in a hospital, all that paperwork got signed already, right? So if you're trying to get informed consent again, that's going to be a little bit arduous. And we've always kind of been like, yeah, but that's an exception. Well, now they're going to enshrine that. Hopefully, I guess. I don't know how I feel about this because I don't really know the situation. I'm not really sure. I think it's a good idea. So the proposed amendment requires the same level of notice and public protection that is currently required, while also creating a regulation that is not overly burdensome or impossible to comply with when you work at a prison or a hospital or a big agency. So they do highlight it for us. Here's the new one. A licensee acting within the scope of employment with an agency or institution is not required to obtain a signed informed consent, but must document in writing that the licensee informed the client of the information required by subsection A and that the client consented. So subsection A isn't going to change. They're going to need to write down, hey, I talked about this with my client. I went over it with them. They nodded and said they understood. And here's me writing that down. So I don't have to get like the client's signature anymore if it's impossible or if that would put a burden that I can't comply with because I'm in this huge institutional setting. So that's number one. The second one is related to client records. This proposed new rule transfers the existing requirements for records from 681.41 to here, and they highlighted it, thank you. Records created by a licensee during the scope of employment with an agency or institution must be maintained by the licensee unless the records are maintained by the employer. So see, the rule before just said, hey, you're off the hook if you're employed or contracted by this. Well, that assumes a lot, doesn't it? It assumes that you're working for someone who follows the rules or who has a similar license to you, or, right? There is no guarantee that who you're working for is going to follow the same rules that you have to follow. So this, I think, is interesting. Again, this is not a rule yet. This is a proposed rule. Records created by a licensee during the scope of employment. They took out the word contract, didn't they? Huh. Well, that's interesting. I just noticed that. So maybe I'm mistaken. I'll go back and look. Records created by a licensee during the scope of employment with an agency or institution must be maintained by the licensee. That's me. I'm employed, but I maintain them unless the employer says I don't have to. Well, where would I find that information? In my contract. So when was the last time you looked at your employment contract to get that information? So I'm going to skip through billing and financial stuff. Dual relationships. I'm not going to talk about that today. Yeah, and that's just a cleanup rule. They go through and they have to repeal and do stuff because it messes up all the fancy tabs and indentations. So in a nutshell, the proposed rules are going to take the burden off of us if our contract says so. I guess that's the best way to put it. So as they exist now, they state if you're employed or contracted, not your job. However, these new rules state if it is not clear in your contract and you're employed by someone. I mean, this is how I'm interpreting it. I'm going to raise my right hand. I'm not an attorney. It's interesting though, because I'm imagining if my practice was owned by, Fred Smith, non-licensed person, and he got a subpoena, and he happens to own my electronic health records where I store all my notes. And he's like, or maybe he didn't get a subpoena. Maybe he just got a phone call. Hey, I need to see Gina Smith's notes. Oh, all right, here, right? He might release them. I mean, I know I'm being scary here. I'm thinking of worst case, but I think, no, that's kneecapping out. I'm not going to think. Here's what I believe. I believe you need to make sure you take a good look at your contract. And if it is not clear who the custodian is, that needs to be revisited. That needs to be crystal clear in the rules, or else, in addition to seeing 85 clients a week and all the things that you have to do, because you do have to work a lot, you're going to also be responsible for records and you had no idea. So please take away from this training, take a look at your contract. If you're a supervisor and your LPC associate is employed somewhere, have them go pull their contract. Have them go ask for a copy of their contract. You guys sit down together, see if it spells out who the custodian is for those records. And then if it's not good, if it's not a good answer, or if the custodian is the agency owner or the private practice owner, ask if that person holds a license. Ask if they understand the job of custodian. Because I guarantee you, if something bad went down, HIPAA's going to want to know, right? I mean, boards are going to want to know. So we have time for questions. I'm going to go ahead and hit pause on the recording. Hopefully I will get this thing up. Unfortunately, if it's not going to be live when I put it into our Facebook group, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to do some tech work here to figure out why we didn't go live today, but I'm going to hit pause. And if you're on the recording today, you can ask me questions. So here I go.